Welcome to the deep dive.
Great to be here.
We've got quite a stack of articles and research notes here today.
Yeah, it looks like a deep one.
We're plunging right into the Kingdom of Eswatini, which, used to be called Swaziland.
Right.
Our goal is basically to unpack all this material, pull out the key insights, and give you a real shortcut to understanding this, well, pretty unique Southern African country.
Sounds good. We'll be covering the history, geography, politics, culture, economy, the whole picture, really.
All filtered through what these specific sources are telling us.
Exactly. Starting with the basics, but digging in quickly.
Yeah.
Like, where is Eswatini? And what's its fundamental setup? Because the sources really tie that to its identity.
Okay, let's jump right in then. Where is it on the map?
So it's this small, landlocked country tucked away in southern Africa. It's got Mozambique to the northeast, and then South Africa pretty much wraps around the northwest and south.
And size-wise?
Just over 17,000 square kilometers.
Yeah.
It's not huge.
And right off the bat, something really unique jumps out from the sources.
The absolute monarch.
Yeah, highlighted as the last one remaining in the world. And the material really stresses how everything, life, politics, culture, identity, it's all tied back to the king.
It really seems like that single fact is the thread connecting almost everything in these documents.
Right.
It influences governance, social structures, even the economy in, subtle and not so subtle ways.
Right.
We also see it's demographically young, over 30% under 15, more than 60% between 15 and 64.
And ethnically.
Overwhelmingly Swazi, like 88.6%.
And languages. The sources list a few.
Yep. Songa, English, Siswati, which is Swazi, and Portuguese are all mentioned as official.
Transport seems okay, a decent road network.
Yeah, the sources mention a well-developed road network, which is important for a landlocked country.
Okay, and geographically, sounds like it's quite varied.
Definitely. The sources break it down into three main regions. First, there's the High Veld. Think mountains, waterfalls, gorges, big granite rocks. That's where a lot of the tourist stuff and nature reserves are.
Then the Middle Veld.
Right. They call that the breadbasket. It's more about farming, livestock, crops, sugarcane, forestry. And that's where you find towns like Manzini and Mboban.
And the last one?
The Low Veld, that's drier, hotter, more like savanna bush, those scattered hills called kopjes, acacia trees, lots of cattle ranches and game reserves down there.
So 3 quite distinct environments.
Exactly.
The sources also flag a big focus on protecting cultural heritage.
Specific laws mentioned, like the National Trust and the Antiquities Act.
Yeah.
And the Royal Kraal in Lobamba is pointed out as a key site.
And it goes deeper than just sites, right?
Oh, yeah. The material really emphasizes the rich oral history, myths, legends, traditions for different tribes. It's described as being absolutely core to identity, not just old stories, things people are expected to know.
A living history.
Precisely.
So moving back in time, the history covered here goes back surprisingly far.
It really does. We're talking Stone Age hunters, maybe 25,000 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah, the earliest folks were nomadic hunters, gatherers, fishers. They left behind tools and, maybe most interestingly, rock paintings, described as these art-rich records.
And the San people are mentioned specifically.
Right, hunter-gatherers who were apparently there until pretty recently, relatively speaking. Their rock paintings are preserved in places like the Lamati River area, Molacho Reserve.
Though less so elsewhere.
Yeah, apparently less well preserved in areas like what's now Kruger Park in South Africa.
Okay, and then later arrivals.
This is interesting. Bantu farmers arise later, part of these big migrations across southern Africa. They displaced the hunter-gatherers who retreated to the mountains. But here's the thing the sources highlight. They didn't just push them out. They learned from them. Adopted knowledge from the Bushmen.
Like what?
Well, the sources point to the Bantu learning how to domesticate honeybees, for example, and learning about edible plants, medicinal properties of flora.
Ah, interesting.
Though there's a note that later, the Swazi apparently linked this plant knowledge more to witchcraft than formal medicine. You can even see traces in their proverbs, apparently.
And without written records, archaeology is key.
Absolutely. Understanding this history relies heavily on that physical evidence. They mention finding old one tools, super old in river gravels, and Acheulean sites with hand axes in the Kamati Valley.
And those rock painting sites, more than just art?
Yeah, they're seen as valuable geosites. They tell us about shelter use, maybe ritual practices, alongside the artwork itself.
The origins of the Swazi people themselves are linked to specific areas.
Places like Nalangano Hills or Mutshane are mentioned in the material.
Okay, fast forward a bit. Late 16th century.
We see the Swazi near Lafizi described as a matrilineal society under a leader named Ingwan.
And expanding.
Yeah, Ingwan had expansionist policies which led to clashes with neighbors, especially the Nwanwe.
Then the Zulu invasion. That sounds significant.
Very. It forced Ingwan to actually seek refuge with Nwanwe, their rivals. But later, the Zulu beat the Nwanwe.
Okay.
And after that, the Swazi, now under a leader named Sabone, settled in areas that are important today, like near the King Siphoza II Memorial Park.
And the territory kept growing under Mswati later on.
Right, in the 19th century.
Yeah.
Which kind of leads us into the period where outside powers really start drawing lines on the map, the colonial era.
The borders we see today were largely set then.
Yeah, the sources confirm that. Treaties with the UK in 1881 and later Mozambique in 1906. There was an earlier British Boer Treaty in 1886 setting boundaries. But the material points out the Boers didn't stick to it, pushed the border further north.
Now, here's a key thing the sources bring up about British motives changing.
Yeah, initially, late 19th century, a big driver was the idea of rich gold mines there.
But that didn't pan out.
Nope. The sources say that prospect was pretty much discredited by the Boer War, which was mainly fought over the Rand gold fields elsewhere. After that war, Swaziland fell under British control more definitively.
And the British knew about internal issues.
Oh yeah, the Colonial Office was aware of disputes within the Swazi royal family, but apparently saw them mostly as just an inconvenience.
So 1902, this royal commission arrives.
Right, sent to investigate the great trouble around the king. And what they found, according to the sources, was the royal family basically tearing itself apart over who should succeed.
And the British had a preference.
It seemed so. They wanted a king they could, work with for their own ruling purposes. A candidate was chosen after what the sources rather dismissively call Australian-style elections among the princes.
Suggesting it wasn't exactly a traditional process.
Probably not. And this led to a really crucial moment. The British made the chosen candidate sign a document imposing strict conditions.
Giving Britain power.
Supposedly unlimited power, though Britain apparently denied that interpretation. This happened in 1903, making Swaziland formally a British protectorate.
And the local population.
The sources say they weren't really formally told, but it caused a lot of local sensation. This move also shifted control of native loans and railways to the British, and they tried to impose their voting rules too.
This history seems well documented, though.
Yeah, based on a prominent Swazi historian, using accounts from local reporters at the time, with cross-referencing to later writers supporting his accuracy. That 1881 protectorate even included the Xenza people, who are now in South Africa.
So years of British rule followed, causing friction.
Understandably. Especially institutions they imposed, like the chief and council system from 1903. By the late 1940s, Swazi politicians were pushing for reforms.
Then, 1960, the British announced independence is coming.
Right, though they kept control over foreign affairs and internal security until the parliament was properly set up. An indirectly elected parliament started under temporary rules drafted by the British.
But not a smooth transition.
Far from it. Those 1964 elections, followed by protests, unrest, political parties getting banned, a state of emergency, lots of arrests, a real mess.
Still, independence was granted in '68.
September 6, 1968. But then, and this is a huge turn noted in the sources just a few years later, in 1973, King Siphoza II issues a decree.
And does what?
Abolishes the Constitution and the Parliament. Just like that.
Wow. Okay, so that takes us into governance under colonialism and afterwards.
And the sources really emphasize how local governance was shaped by all this history, economics, and especially colonialism.
Before the British arrived, it was mainly traditional chiefs.
Yeah, a decentralized tribal system. The chief or headman ran local affairs, promoted agriculture vital for the extended families. It was patriarchal, men heading families.
Land was communal.
Held by the chiefs who allocated plots for people to cultivate. The chief had a lot of decision-making power. Disputes were settled by custom, often with a council and traditional doctors involved.
Colonialism messed with that.
Big time. Here's a critical insight from the sources. Colonial land policies directly attacked this system. They played around with land concepts, basically sidelining chiefs from real political power over people.
Leaving them just in charge of land.
Pretty much. Which created this disconnect, chiefs managing land for subjects who felt their traditional governance structure was being taken away, left them managing disgruntled people.
And the legacy of that
is that there's no single common local governance framework today. It's fragmented, partly because of that colonial history and partly because of all the different development groups working there since independence.
Oh, okay, so against that background, independence movements start growing mid-century.
Right, mirroring what was happening across Africa. And Mswati, the Swazi people, start organizing politically.
The NNLC emerges in 63.
The Ngwane National Liberatory Congress came out of labor unrest, awareness of politics elsewhere, but also a real focus on Swazi culture.
And what did they want?
They challenged the colonial system directly, wanted to restore Swazi paramountcy, basically, traditional rule, and get voting rights for everyone.
They even tried writing a constitution.
A sort of proto-constitution in 1964 proposed a parliament with two houses, including a House of Kings. But the sources say traditionalists, the king and his appointees, resisted it. So those proposed upper houses barely met before independence.
What happened to the NNLC?
It eventually collapsed around 1989 after the king kicked them out of the assembly, but loyal members didn't give up.
They formed something new.
Yeah, called for a new movement. Led to the People's United Democratic Movement, PUDM, launching in September '89. They were critical of how slow change was, which led to internal splits about tactics, especially protests.
And the reaction.
Brutal, according to the sources. A state of emergency was declared. King Mswati reportedly ordered the PUDM crushed.
How bad was it?
The sources talk about thousands of arbitrary arrests, torture described in really horrific terms, unimaginable levels, people forced into exile, hundreds reported dead. It's portrayed as the start of a really oppressive regime.
But this unified the opposition.
Seems like it. That shared experience pushed the population and PUDM cadres together, aiming to overthrow what they called an illegitimate government.
And eventually, negotiations.
Secret ones, the material says, which led to a new constitution being signed in 1992. The intention was democratic elections, a multi-party state.
But navigating the present still shows big challenges. Post-independence issues persisted.
Yeah, things like racial and political segregation drew international criticism.
So after UN criticism in 74, some laws eased up.
Some did, but critically, and this is a key point from the sources, the Constitution itself stayed suspended, and King Siphuza II never wrote it down.
Seriously.
That's what the sources say. So its provisions were just interpreted, often in ways that enforced censorship, oppression, press limits, and kept political parties banned.
The people still organized?
Despite the bans, yeah. Unregistered parties, churches, groups held rallies. Things really escalated after 12 opposition members were tried for treason.
What happened then?
House arrests, attacks on the Swaziland news offices, the unrest spread border posts, railways, businesses were affected. The government brought in the police and military.
International pressure had an effect.
It led to the military withdrawing from direct political roles. But the violence didn't stop. It just became more political, deepening that divide between the haves and have-nots.
Then an attempted coup in 92.
An abortive one, yeah.
Yeah.
Attacks on a stadium, the king's residence. But ironically, the sources say this actually triggered a limited liberalization process, led to the limited democracy they have today, clearly a major focus for King Mswati III.
And people brought concerns directly to the king.
Yeah, a delegation presented issues from the youth, things like how the next king is chosen, corruption, unhappiness with that early constitution, the unrest.
And the government made promises.
A king from the Swazi people, economic reforms, a new constitution drafted by an appointed body, releasing political prisoners, allowing discussion forums, not interfering with civil society parties.
Even acknowledging parties.
There was a proposal to potentially do that after consultations, which, could have reduced the monarch's power.
But looking at where things are now constitutionally.
Reports consistently say dialogue is vital for stability. But, and the sources stress this, any internal dialogue needs a strong response to international human rights concerns alongside it. Political dialogue is seen as essential to fix the crisis.
But the recent climate sounds worrying.
Yeah, described as an era of police criminality, threats, protest bans, all increasing the risk of human rights abuses.
And the judiciary.
This is a major concern flagged in the material claims of brazen judicial capture, acting with near impunity even when international courts rule against the government.
Any examples?
The Suppression of Terrorism Act is pointed out, passed with no public dialogue, leading to court challenges about its legality and constitutionality.
Creating confusion.
Exactly. Described as leading to a patchwork interpretation of the Constitution. Ambiguity around defining terrorism, judicial independence. It results in contradictory court decisions, questioning if the judiciary is even effective. The sources really highlight that this needs scrutiny for its impact on stability.
Okay, let's shift to the economy. Classify it as lower middle income.
By the World Bank, yes. But the reality painted by the sources is stark. over 60% poor, 28% in extreme poverty.
Progress on some development goals, but not others.
Made some progress on Millennium Development Goals, but lagging on broader human development. GDP is around $4 billion, growing slowly, maybe 2.5% average. Treasury handles about 65% of that.
And poverty rates haven't improved much.
Slow progress. 69% in 2001, down only to 63% by 2010. Still 30% extremely poor then. Reflected in the low Human Development Index, ranked 149 out of 187 in 2010.
A key reason mentioned is inequality.
Extreme income disparity. It doesn't just slow poverty reduction. The sources argue it actively holds back growth, and you see it in unequal access to basic services, health, education.
They mentioned the Gini coefficient.
0.54 in 2010, which is high, reflecting that inequality. Shows the huge challenge in tackling both poverty and inequality.
And the government's ability to help is weaker.
Especially post-2008 crisis. Before that, boom times meant surpluses, allowing for some redistribution, social safety nets. That capacity declined.
So even when they spend on health and education,
The impact on poverty and inequality is limited because access is just so unequal. And a huge limiting factor the sources point to is the very low capacity to actually deliver services in rural areas,
why is that?
often thwarted by the national development approach, which tends to favor big, fast-track, capital-intensive projects. These usually benefit urban areas or the well-off agricultural centers, not the remote rural areas.
Okay, what about key industries? Sugarcane is big.
Leading the way, yeah. Major employer, big contributor to GDP and foreign exchange, second largest GDP contributor overall. The climate and soil are great for it.
But challenges exist.
Complexities in marketing affect profitability.
In tourism,
Also important revenue, especially with a small population. The material emphasizes the role Swazis themselves could play, maybe hosting guests. Suggests they need to better advertise what makes Eswatini unique.
what kind of attractions are mentioned?
Abundant water, sunshine, small game parks that bring income to locals, New Year fireworks. Even caves are mentioned as potential attractions.
After 68, there was a push to modernize the economy.
Yeah, away from just subsistence farming towards industrialization, there's a big plan involving the Mubluluzi and Komati rivers.
Aiming for irrigated industrial agriculture.
Right, with infrastructure for processing sugar, citrus, timber. But the sources note tensions around labor, investment, transport could affect completion.
And these big water projects cause other issues.
Definitely. They bring transboundary problems into focus. Who controls the river water, pollution, political tensions with neighbors? Expected to get more intense.
Okay, let's switch gears slightly. Trade and connections sounds like there are deep historical roots.
Oh yeah, long-established ties across the region. Bechuanaland, Southern Transvaal, Eswatini, Cape Colony areas. Tong mentioned as a key trading hub, people making wagon journeys back and forth.
And early transport links.
The first regular coach mail service in southern Africa ran from Pietermaritzburg to Barberton, even reaching Bloemfontein. Later, a regular coach service started within Eswatini, linking towns.
Early shops.
First store mentioned was at Loom. As little shops grew in bush centers, there's this specific detail about a stone wall built around the store in Sifikosini
Why?
for the protection of native customers. A small detail, but tells you something about the time.
Communications developed too?
Postal service started, and by 1907 they had telegraph and telephone service built across tough terrain. The sources also sprinkle in these other historical tidbits.
Like what?
Failed spas near Joburg, an old magazine, a teacher who invented a bandage, comparative education via missions, night schools sparking interest in literature. Just little glimpses of the social fabric back then.
Okay, health and education now. What's the structure?
Education. Primary is free and compulsory, ages 7-13. Public schools often run by religious missions.
A specific school mentioned.
Luyengo Secondary, set up in the late 70s by timber companies to train workers. First secondary school offering higher technical training.
And government strategies?
Ministry of Education has things like Education for All, saw positive changes in primary enrollment by 2010. Also initiatives like integration through appropriate technology, non-formal education, funding schemes.
Helping access.
Yeah, provided access for over 240,000 kids, aiming to cut dropouts.
But challenges remain in education.
Definitely. Transition from home to school is hard for some without kindergarten. Mention of students skipping subjects sometimes. Diverse backgrounds in public schools. Necessity tests for enrollment.
Discouraging factors.
Things like inattentive teaching, lack of consequences for low scores, difficulty adapting lessons to the local context are cited.
Now, the health sector, the sources sound pretty dire.
Seriously dire straits is the phrase used. Chronic lack of resources, infrastructure much worse in rural areas, limited access to facilities.
Service delivery struggles.
Yeah, due to those resource limits, plus an ill-defined system, unequal resource distribution, poor management, lack of accountability, serious underfunding, corruption mentioned, and the referral system barely works.
There's a quote from the Director of Health Services.
Yeah, saying resources are too few, poorly distributed, and even more poorly utilized. Really damning.
Doctor shortages.
Government target of 1 per 10,000 missed badly. Only about 25 doctors in the whole public sector. Rural areas incredibly underserved. 1 doctor for the entire Lubombo region mentioned as an example.
Even urban care is bad.
Queues over 4 hours are common.
And the border with South Africa adds pressure.
People crossing for healthcare, yeah. Plus, the system favors treating illness over preventing it. No clear procedures for working with schools or communities.
Planning issues, too.
Poor planning. No clear systems for managers' duties. Undermining monitoring. The broken referral system means patients get lost, wait ages, hospitals get overcrowded, and no unified electronic health record system.
Paints a picture of a system really struggling.
Absolutely.
Okay, environment. Lots of land used for farming.
Over 75% farmed or grazed makes the population very vulnerable to habitat loss, species loss.
Natural resources are key to the economy.
Contribute about 57% of GDP. Corn and sugarcane are major crops. Industry, led by sugar refining and agriculture, is around 52% of GDP.
But that sugar industry has environmental costs.
Relies on monoculture, heavy pesticide and fertilizer use. And then there's climate change having a big impact.
How so?
Sources note annual rainfall has dropped dramatically, 900 millimeters down to 590 millimeters over 60 years, resulting in longer droughts, but also sudden heavy downpours.
Creating uncertainty for farmers.
Exactly. Widens the window of risk. Forces spending on tech and inputs. Need better weather forecasting. More rain could be good, but the uncertainty around timing and intensity is a huge risk, especially for cash flow.
And this hits poor farmers hardest.
Disproportionately increases inequality, yeah. It's not just if bad weather hits, but when. Late spring, harvest time. Timing is critical and unpredictable now.
Where are the effects most noticeable?
Especially the low veld. Higher temps in cooler seasons, frequent droughts, shorter rainy seasons, more dry days. Expected to directly hit food production and access in vulnerable areas.
There's an example year.
2014-15 farming season. A dry spell cut maize yields by 31% from the previous year. Less than a quarter of what the country needed.
And climate change impacts the S&L sector most.
The Swazi nation land agriculture, which already has low productivity, farmers link maize decline there directly to floods, dry spells, rising temps, changing rain patterns, soil changes.
Farming is crucial but vulnerable.
Supports 80% of local livelihoods, significant GDP and employment share. So for the local economy, mostly rain-fed, climate variability directly means more food insecurity and poverty. It's a daily reality.
But there are positive environmental actions.
Yeah, sources highlight local communities being active in protection, conservation, resource management, nationwide programs, environmental education, awareness campaigns using films, posters,
and official protection.
The National Trust Commission protects important archaeological, geological, historical sites for biodiversity. Department of Environmental Affairs is the focal point for the Biodiversity Convention, working with others like the Royal Science and Technology Park.
Okay, internationally, Eswatini's place in the world.
Second smallest country in Africa by area. Geographically interesting, southern end of the East African Rift System. Some rare alkaline volcanic complexes, unique lakes.
The Lubombo Mountains form a border.
Natural border with Mozambique, yeah.
Yeah.
And the geology is ancient, over 4 billion years old. Some of Africa's oldest rocks in the Barberton Greenstone Belt. Granite formations 3.6 billion years old, with massive cave systems.
Later geological events shaped it too.
Things like the Limpopo Mobile Belt, Mesozoic tectonics created unique escarpments, deep gorges. This ancient geology really defines its physical character.
Regionally, it's part of SADC.
Joined in '92. Works towards SADC goals like regional integration. But the sources offer a critique here.
Oh.
Say these initiatives are often seen as high-level policies, club-style commitments, without enough thought for the local context.
Meaning not much buy-in locally.
Leads to little commitment at lower levels, the sources say. Commitments are unpopular, poorly understood, not well supported, sometimes seen as just justifying regionalism itself.
But the formal idea is cooperation.
Pooling sovereignty for things like free movement, trade, security, through various protocols.
Since independence in '68, foreign policy has been key.
And the sources suggest Eswatini's policy, both domestic and foreign, can sometimes look like a system of fragmented government.
Meaning?
Policies might not always be fully coordinated or centrally driven.
Globally, it's active in international bodies.
The UN, African Union, SADC, Commonwealth. Post-independence relations, generally described as amicable, based on
Foreign policy goals.
national prosperity, peace, welfare. Prioritizing stability for development. Willing to help with negotiations. Yes, minor ones, if asked. Acknowledges limits but can handle reasonable standard negotiations. Recognizes the human factor, emotional closeness, can hinder success.
But needs help on bigger issues.
Yeah, peace security needs comprehensive approaches. Assistance from countries with more resources. The king was made a peace ambassador in 2000, helped mediate in Madagascar in 2002. Initial involvement apparently prevented Madagascar's suspension.
Okay, let's turn to social issues. HIV is a huge burden.
Highly impacted. Sources stress needing a sustainable, integrated strategy, tackling the social roots, unmet needs, seen fundamentally as a social issue, not just health.
Different from neighbors' instability.
While neighbors like Lesotho face political instability, Eswatini's challenges are dominated by other factors. That high HIV burden, structural poverty, and really deep-seated stigma.
Stigma is a major barrier.
Severely impacts trust, community mobilization. Makes formal prevention and care harder. Treatment access has improved, RT in public facilities, thanks to partners.
But gaps remain.
Limited outreach to vulnerable groups. And people living with HIV often lack good quality of life. Psychosocial, economic support. The health system just isn't equipped for that holistic care.
Inequality impacts health directly.
Leads to those sobering health stats. And education is hindered by costs for poor families. Rural kids face distance, lack of transport, bad roads.
Class-based education.
Tends to perpetuate wealth gaps, the sources note. And political unrest has led to reports of elite students being favored, schools suspended.
Women face specific challenges.
More likely poor, early marriage pregnancy, custodianship by men often. Many are single heads of households. Limited education networks make farming harder. In communities hit by the epidemic, women often become primary caregivers. Families get disrupted.
Responses in informal settlements slow.
Yeah, inadequate engagement.
Yeah.
But community mobilization has shown some positive results. More condom use, some structural change on rights, reduced stigma in places, even lower prevalence sometimes. But continuity is key.
Human rights concerns have a long history.
Go back to the 1920s. Revived in the late 80s, when the political activity ban was briefly lifted. But efforts to form parties were crushed in '73 when King Siphoza II suspended the constitution, brought in laws against subversive parties, claiming they were usurping his power.
Legal status of customary law is an issue.
Yeah, the king's proclamation and customary law needed legal effect after that '73 move. And the sources argue customary law often isn't non-discriminatory by international human rights standards, which are binding.
Rights can be limited, but
Filters exist for terrorism, public safety, etc., but must operate within a clear legal framework. A core point. Accountability of authorities is key to democracy, yet often there's no right to be heard before decisions curtailing freedom are made.
decisions must be reasonable.
Engaging relevant factors impartially. The whole discussion points to this ongoing tension between traditional authority, the monarchy, and international human rights norms.
Okay, shifting to tourism and culture. Seems like a growing sector.
Significant economic sector, yeah. Growing interest in ecotourism. The country has amazing geodiversity, unique landscapes, rocks, fossils. These geosites,
Like what?
rugged mountains, plateaus, gorges like the Great Usutu, that massive granite rock. Sebebe monolith may be the oldest on Earth. Highlands have caves, minerals, fossils.
Archaeological finds, too.
Iron Age ruins, ancient mines in the Barberton Greenstone Belt area called the Cradle of the Swazi Nation, and having some of the oldest sites globally.
But these geological sites aren't well promoted.
Surprisingly little attention from the ecotourism sector, the sources say. Not well marketed, despite having outstanding scientific value and potential. Remarkable potential there.
Beyond geology, what are the attractions?
National parks, craft markets, cultural villages, historical sites. The Malilwane Wildlife Sanctuary is mentioned, first protected area, saved by the Swazi Nation itself, known for biodiversity, trails.
And bigger parks?
Flane Royal National Park, Royal Park, elephants, lions, savanna. And Makaya Game Reserve, more exclusive, great for seeing rhinos, sable, other animals on 4x4 safaris, limited beds.
Protected areas also protect culture.
Ancient sites, customs, knowledge, growing pride seen in things like revitalizing a traditional two-day cultural walk. Authentic villages. Rock engravings mentioned too.
Cultural tourism blends old and new.
Yeah, sites like the cultural village are touchstones. Even the geology is part of the cultural landscape story. In the source is how the land itself shapes the narrative.
And the Swazi people are the creators.
Artists, musicians, dancers, craftspeople, wood carving, stone sculpting, basketry, beadwork, weaving, pottery, dances, songs. A lot persists in traditional forms.
But contemporary artists are adapting.
Using traditional media to comment on modernization. Local institutions display traditions but struggle to promote preservation. Some arts retain original forms, others adapt elements from neighbors like Zulu dance or Western church music, creating hybrid styles.
A mix of influences.
Positive and negative, producing these hybrids, adds richness, but there's a worry specific traditions might get lost in trends.
Tradition is a source of pride, though.
Hugely. Open profession of ethnic roots, big annual ceremonies around the king displaying ancestral beliefs. The beauty of the land mountains, valleys mentioned alongside people practicing ancient rituals fervently, even with modern tech around.
The proud Swazi symbol.
Embodies protection, loyalty, unity, peace, courage. Heritage displayed through regalia, attire dating back centuries, influencing today's colorful clothes. Specific items named, like ingubo, colorful cloth worn on shoulders, terracotta animal skin, silk embroidery, beads, cowhide, symbolizing love or milestones, worn at big ceremonies like Umhlanga reed dance, king's birthday.
Arts and crafts details.
Cluster weaving, popular post-1940s. Wall floor decorating with woven grass likely existed before. Brass gifts were important. Designs copied in grass weaving, maybe showing status. A specific belt with Thunzi plant brasses mentioned as rediscovering ethnicity.
Basket weaving revived.
Ancient practice of flat baskets with palm handles, competed with painting historically. Both needed abstract decoration. Sources even mention specific reeds from specific chiefs' lands and the advantage of palmyra palms. Paintings showed chiefs, horses, cloth seen as showing pictorial independence. Arts are clearly tied deeply to history and identity, so looking ahead, prospects and tensions. Those geosites again.
Mohamba Gorge, Baby Monolith, Gob Hollow Cave, Pigs Peak Rocks. Remarkable places.
Plus rock paintings, old mines. They add to Africa's unique offerings. Great potential for geotourism, which is growing globally. Could bring income, support parks. Ecotourism generally is seen as a responsible path. Tourism is a priority.
Economically, sugarcane still has potential.
Seen as having growth potential, still leading employment, GDP, foreign exchange. But the paradox remains.
Rich resources, but still facing huge social problems.
Exactly. Least developed country status, unemployment, poverty, malnutrition, food insecurity, HIV/AIDS, climate change impacts. Huge hurdles.
Sugarcane could be part of the solution.
Viewed as the most profitable agriculture, potentially paving the way for sustainable, inclusive operations if managed well.
Politically, efforts to manage unrest continue.
Changes to the Public Order Act in '99 were aimed at handling protests against the low-key authoritarianism, though criticized. Before that, people often protested without permits anyway.
The sources mention theories on stability.
Grievance, collective perception, political opportunity. If legitimate channels are closed, people might do nothing, or resort to disruption if they think they can. But disruption has cost state repression.
And history matters.
The state-society relationship shapes things. A key insight for small states like Eswatini. The cost of doing nothing might seem low, but the fear of angering the regime often outweighs the grievance itself. That fear is a powerful stabilizing factor, in a way.
Wow. Okay, that was definitely a deep dive. We've covered so much ground, from ancient roots right up to today's complex picture.
Yeah, a country really defined by that traditional monarchy and culture, set against stunning landscapes, but facing really significant hurdles.
We've seen the deep-seated poverty and inequality, the immense strain on health and education, climate vulnerability, and that intricate political situation.
Shaped by its unique history and those ongoing tensions we discussed.
But also the potential, and things like sugarcane, tourism, its unique cultural offerings, and its complex diplomatic role.
The sources definitely paint a picture of resilience, people navigating this path between deeply embedded traditions and the pressures of the modern world.
Absolutely. So here's something for you, the listener, to think about after all this.
In a world where most nations have moved towards democracy, what does Eswatini's persistence as an absolute monarchy really tell us about that relationship between cultural identity, tradition, and political power?
And crucially, how does that unique setup impact its ability to tackle those really pressing modern challenges like poverty, health crises, and inequality.
Something to chew on.
Definitely. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.